Take my heart, wash my soul, renew my mind and make me whole. Take my heart.
Okay, so we are in Esther chapter 9, finishing all the way. Chapter 10's only literally got like 3 or 4 verses, so we're going to finish today, no bother. So back, first slide, to Esther 9, chapter 9, verse 5. Okay, and this is, we looked at last week, just kind of refresh going into what we're going to be this morning, finishing out. If you remember this slide, we called it P-Day instead of D-Day, because, P for Purim, which was clever. I like that. I'm going to copyright that. But there's 2 days. This is P-Day number 1. And again, this is a review from last week, back in verse 5. So the Jews went ahead on the appointed day and struck down their enemies with the sword. So we've already talked about the preparation of the battle, the preparation of the war, and its nature of being self-defense. I think it's important to remind ourselves right now what the nature of this war is. It's for self-defense. Haman basically declared war upon Mordecai and his people, the Jews. And they, using, lots, which Purim means lots, to cast lots. They used lots to determine the day in which this mass persecution was going to happen. So, but then Haman was uncovered as being a big jerk. And so he's dead now. He's dead now. But the problem still stands, because once the king's signet ring is used to declare something, it can't be revoked. And so the king said, well, here, take my signet ring and see what you can do with it, guys. And so what they were doing was able to with the king's signet ring, to be able to declare a day of self-defense. And so that's what we're looking at. We're looking at the day, this two-day war, from the Jewish perspective, is to defend their lives. So, on that point today, they struck down their enemies. They killed and annihilated their enemies and did as they pleased with those who hated them. In the fortress of Susa itself, the Jews killed 500 men. They also killed these fellas, who were the 10 sons of Haman, who's the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. But they did not take any plunder. I'm going to spend the next few moments looking at this, the ethics behind this, because again, we talk about the reasons for war, and God has a different reason for war and having an army than people do. And people, I think, nowadays, in order to be justified in war, I think is to defend the innocent people, both at home and abroad. But to take plunder, so for economic gain, I think that's not ethical. I don't think that's right. I don't think it's right to enter into wars to plunder people, to take from someone. And I think that's cool, because as we saw here in Esther 8, earlier in Esther 8:11, that actually they were allowed to do that. The king. And I like this because the ethics of the Jews were a different standard than the ethics of the king of Persia. And I like that they have a different standard. And sometimes as Christians, our standard should be higher than the standard of the authority, the governors, the kings, whatever, So reminding ourselves in Esther 8:11, the king's decree gave the Jews in every city authority to unite to defend their lives. So again, the purpose is defend. They were allowed to kill, slaughter, and annihilate anyone who, of any nationality or province, who might attack them, or their children and wives, and to take the property of their enemies. So there's a difference. So here they're allowed to take the property of their enemies, but here they didn't do it. I think, again, there's a reason why, and that reason why is ethical in nature. And again, the purpose, like I said, of this war isn't to make gain. It isn't to prosper economically. It's to defend innocent lives, people. And as we're going to see here when we look at the Purim celebration, it's not about punishing the wealth of people by taking wealth away from people and redistributing it. It's about being helpful and having character of helping the poor so that they can celebrate. And we're going to look at that more a little later on. That's going to be the second half of today's Bible study. So in the next slide, here, we revisited this verse last week, and this is one of those hard verses where God asks Saul to do something that seems very ungodly. But God's reasons for war, we talked about, are different than our reasons. And so in this account, we looked at how he told him to just completely annihilate a whole group of people, a nation of people. And I said, like we dealt with the hard issue, we dealt with why last week, so I'm not going to go into that. But I'm going to look at Saul's response to that. Did Saul do what God asked him to do? Okay? And so going all the way down into verse 16, it says that Samuel says to Saul, this is after the fact. Okay? So Samuel's visiting Saul after this battle, this war against the Amalekite nation. And he says to Saul, stop. Listen to what the Lord has told me last night. What did he tell you? Saul asked. And Samuel told him, although you may think a little of yourself, are you not the leader of the tribes of Israel? So he had a bit of a significance issue. He wasn't confident in himself and he had a poor esteem of himself. As a leader. Oh, I'm too small for this job. And the thing is, sometimes we feel that way when we're called into ministry and called into leadership. But there's a time where you need to just overcome that and do what you're told by God. And I think that's what's going on here. Is like, but you may think little of yourself. You might have this sense of humility. But regardless, you're called to be the leader of people, and you need to do what is right. So what's right in this situation? Well, we're going to get to it quickly. What's right situation isn't. Well, it's following the direction of the chief and commander, who is ultimately the Lord, God. And God told him what to do, and he didn't do it. Okay? So, the Lord had anointed you, the king of Israel, and the Lord sent to you on a mission and told you, go and completely destroy the sinners, the Amalekites. And again, remember, we talked a little bit about what the Amalekite people were like and how they completely opposed Israel since day one after they left Egypt to come into the promised land. They've been a constant problem. And so God said, we need to deal with this. And again, what's prescribed here to do is to wipe them all out until they are all dead. Why haven't you obeyed the Lord? Why did you rush for the plunder and do what was evil in the Lord's sight? So again, here we see that God is not interested in plundering the people. His reason's a lot different. And the thing is, I think the risk here is Saul's making it look like, those Israelite people, those people who follow God, they're just wiped out a whole nation of people so they can steal from them. What kind of God is that steals from people, that takes from people? And you see, that's what God's not wanting to happen here. So he's not in the plunder. He's not interested in plundering people. That is evil. That's evil in the sight of the Lord, and it's just evil, full stop. Okay? What we saw here, again, reminding us from last week, is God's righteous judgment upon the sins of the world. That's what God is doing, and he's using Saul. However, Saul took it as an opportunity to plunder the people, which is ethically wrong. And I think this is in the minds of the people of Esther's and why they didn't plunder the people. But Saul tries to justify himself here. And as we do, sometimes we try to justify ourselves. But God, I was thinking, I know you told me to do something, but I was thinking ahead of the game. I was trying to get ahead of you, God, a wee bit, because, I'm smart and I'm clever and all that stuff. That's dangerous. God's a lot more clever than any of us, and he's got it all figured out. We just need to do what he says. I did obey the Lord, Saul said. I carried out the mission he gave me. Well, the mission was to completely wipe out this nation. I brought back King Agag. Well, God didn't tell him to do that. And a lot of this has to do with, again, Saul and maybe his issues of significance. And maybe it's him trying to prove himself. Because you see, back in these days, the king would be brought back as a trophy. I I destroyed the people. Look, I present to you their king. So this is a bit prideful on Saul's part. And that's not what God asked him to do. And then in verse 21, my troops brought in the best of the sheep, goats, cattle, and plunder. That's not what he asked him to do. He told him to destroy these things, not to plunder, but to just annihilate. Why? To sacrifice. But God, if you think about it, if we take these things and sacrifice it to you, then we don't have to sacrifice our sheep, goats, and cattle. You see? So we can have that for other things, to feed our bellies. And so here, God, have it. It's for you. Was that what God wanted? That's all God wanted. So, sacrifice, obedience. We justify ourselves. But God, I give so much to you. I'm there. I'm doing these things. But that's good. You're there. You're dedicating yourself to doing things for the church, for instance, or if your family, whatever. But are you actually listening to God's word and obeying him? And if God's telling you to do something, are you doing it? Because you see, sacrifice is good, but obedience is better. And that's what Samuel says, verse 22. What is more pleasing to the Lord, your burnt offerings and sacrifices that aren't right and justified, or your obedience to his voice? Because see, God has got a plan. God knows what's up. And if we're out of line with what God's doing, then we can make a mess out of things. And I think that's what happened here with Saul. He made a mess out of things. Obedience is better than sacrifice. Just do what you're told. And submission is better than offering the fat of rams. Rebellion is as sinful as witchcraft, and stubbornness as bad as worshiping idols. So because you have rejected the command of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. So, next slide, just to make it crystal clear. Obedience beats sacrifice. Okay? Got it? Obedience beats sacrifice. And I know with our pragmatic way of thinking, you kind of want to justify. But God, I'll give to the poor, I'm nice to the neighbor and everything else, but then maybe you're not obedient to God in other areas. And maybe in general, just you don't listen to God. But so you try to make yourself feel better by doing things that are sacrificial. And when we look at Purim, the celebration and the disciplines of celebrating, we're going to see how some people, even to our culture today, are disobedient to God. But they justify themselves because of the sacrifice. So put a tick in that, because we're going to look at that once we're done with the war. Next slide. So back in Esther chapter 9, verse 11, we have P-Day number 2, an odd request to continue the war. So Esther 9:11, that very day, when the king was informed of the number of people killed in the fortress of Susa, he called for Queen Esther, and he said, the Jews have killed 500 men in the fortress of Susa alone, as well as Haman's 10 sons. If they have done that here, what has happened to the rest of the provinces? But now, what more do you want? It will be granted to you. Tell me, and I will do it. The first thing to look at here is like, what? 500 people? And later on, she's going to ask in a moment here, for another day. And we're going to ask ourselves, why? Why another day? But at this point, we see 500 men, and that might seem like a lot of people to you. But if you add the 500 men, and then the following day, they go to war again, and it's 300 more men, that's 800 men dead. And you think, that's just unnecessary killing. But again, think about the purpose. The purpose of this is for self-defense. So these are people who came out to kill the Jewish people. This is self-defense. These are literally called later on haters of the Jews. They're people that wanted to see, they took pleasure in the death of this ethnic group. So this is self-defense against haters, And also look at how small the percentage is. You think of it, 500 is a big number. That's a lot of people. That's just needless bloodshed. It wasn't actually, though, compared to what was intended by Haman. Haman wanted to see millions and millions and millions of people die that day. But instead what happened was a fraction of what could have happened. So in Susa, the estimated population is 500,000. So 800 people versus 500,000 is less than 1%. It's just over 1/10%. It's 1/6 of 1% of the population. That's pretty small. Cancer kills a lot more. They say that if you're going to die, which we all do die, that there's, for a man, 1 out of every 4 will die of cancer when they go, and women 1 out of every 5. That's something that's a real threat. Forget about self-defense in Susa. Okay, so going on. Well, what do you want me to do? It'll be granted. What? Tell me what you want to do. And I want to ask another question. Why is the king being so compliant here? And I think the reality is because what we're seeing in context is people are recognizing that God's with the Jews and God's with Esther and God's with Mordecai. And the king's like, dude, if God be for you, I ain't going to be against you. What can I do to help you? And plus, I think he sees here that there is, what was happening here is genuine self-defense. It isn't plundering. It isn't unethical. It isn't wrong. It's a justified war. So the queen says, we need another day to defend ourselves. She's afraid of a backlash. And so in verse 13, Esther's respond, if it please the king, give the Jews in Susa permission to do it again tomorrow. So again, here it looks like it's gone from defense to vengeance. Well, the first day we defend ourselves, but now we want to take vengeance. Let's hit now while the iron's hot. But no, I don't think that's the case. It's again, because it only happened in Susa, because of that's the hot place. It's like the capital, it's the area, it's the region. It's right there where the problems are this concern is deep and great for her. So she's like, we need another day of being able to openly to defend ourselves with the support of the state. Can you please allow us to defend ourselves one more day in this way? And he says, yeah, that's fine. But please the king, give the Jews in Susa permission to do it again, as they have done today. And let the bodies of Haman's 10 sons be impaled on a pole. Now again, is she being unnecessary? Is she being cruel? What's up with this? But again, if you look at the culture, the cross, for instance, the cross. The point of the cross is to make an example out of people. It isn't just to kill a criminal. It's to make an example as a lesson for people. So when you died on the cross, the Romans, first of all, the cross was a horrible weapon of torture. It was a horrible, torturous, laborious death. But why? Was it just to punish a person? No, it's to detract others from doing what that person did. So basically, when you walk by the roads, and the crosses were always hung up in busy roads going in and out of town. And so if you see someone dying on the cross, like Jesus did, you would look and you would put the conviction over their head, like they did with Jesus. This man says he was the king of the Jews, right? Why? And so you would walk into town and you say, okay, this is what I'm not doing today, right? I'm not going to pretend like I'm the king of the Jews. I'm not going to steal or murder, right? Because this is what happens. It's to teach a lesson. It's to get people under control. It's a technique of the state to control, to promote good behavior with the citizens. So that's kind of what happened here. It's like, listen, if you fight tomorrow, you're going to end up like these guys, basically. If you're going to be a hater, count the cost. There's consequences. And here, this is what happened. And these guys were already dead. It's just to put them out as a sign, which again is culturally the norm. Today would have been really weird and cruel and unusual. But at that point, it was a very standard thing to do, to put a point across, to make a message. So, in verse 14, the king agreed, and the decree was announced in Susa, and they impaled the bodies of Haman's 10 sons. And the Jews of Susa gathered together on March the 8th and killed 300 more men. Again, they took no plunder. This is mentioned, I think, 3 or 4 times. Again, that ethical principle that they took no plunder. Next slide, please. In other parts of the kingdom, verse 16, meanwhile, in other parts, the Jews throughout the whole king's province had gathered together to defend their lives. Again, the point is being very crystal clear that the purpose of this battle, purpose of this war is to defend lives. They gained relief from all their enemies, killing 75,000 of those who hated them. So these are haters. These are people who've got this deep hatred against these people for whatever reason. And the thing is, we know that in the world there's haters. There's always going to be people who have hatred in their heart and want to hurt other people and will look for any reason to do it. But the percentage is a lot smaller than what we think. When we look at, again, 75,000, that's a big number. That's a lot of people dying. That's needless bloodshed. But in relationship to actually the percentage of people who live in that empire, it's small potatoes. It's even smaller than what happened in Susa. So the Persian Empire, the estimated population is 500 million people. Okay, don't forget it was a huge empire. Huge empire. This year is literally, oh my gosh, of 1%, it's 1/100th of 1%. That's just over 1/66th of 1% of the population killed in battle. So if you think about it, how many people, if you think of the threats of things like cancer, 1 out of 4 or 5, there's a threat of that happening in this room. But if you think about the threat of haters, that's a very small percentage. And I'm sure most of the haters didn't turn up because they're cowards. Most haters are cowards anyways. But these are haters that were actually aggressors. And they died in battle because of their hatred and their aggression. 1 in every 15,000 people. So that's very small. Very small war in relation to the kind of wars we think about today in the modern days. But they did not take any plunder. Again, it was about self-defense, not about gain. This was done throughout the province of March the 7th. And on March the 8th, they rested, celebrating their victory with a day of feasting and gladness. Ah, yes! Finally, after the stress and the war and the battle, they're going to celebrate their lives. They were almost wiped out as a people, but now they're going to celebrate that they have victory. And we're going to end in the next 5-10 minutes talking about the victory and the celebration. Because listen, guys, it's so important that we celebrate. It's so important to remember to celebrate. And here, and the Jews were good at it. They documented how to celebrate. They wrote it down. This is how we are going to celebrate. Celebrating is important. It's something that we don't do enough, and we don't even know how to do it. When we try to do it, we mess it all up. We think it's all about drinking and getting stupid and fighting. No, that's not celebrating. Celebrating is thinking about the wonderful things of life and talking about the wonderful things of life and the wonderful things of God while having a bite to eat and a thing to drink. You know what I'm saying? It's not just about eating and drinking and stupidity. It's about eating and drinking and giving thanks very rationally, very logically, very intelligently, because it helps the soul and it helps us of yourself and it helps the soul of other people. Next slide, please. So, Purim. And I wonder, when I look at Purim, if this is the granddad of Christmas. This is my own opinion. I didn't look into this too hard. But if you look at how Purim's like, it was a celebration in the winter, and it was a celebration where you give gifts to one another. So I think if we were to apply it, it's like a type of Christmas. If it's not the granddad of Christmas, it's a type of Christmas. Let me look at it with me. Esther 9:19. So to this day, the rural Jews living in remote villages celebrate an annual festival and a holy day on the appointed day in the late winter, when they rejoice and send gifts of food to each other. So it's a day of rejoicing. That's why they're giving gifts. They're giving gifts to bless one another so they can rejoice with one another. It isn't a competition, a commercial, scam. Or, it's at the end of the year, buy all of our dead stock so we don't have to count it next year, which is kind of what happens nowadays in Christmas, unfortunately. But the genuine nature of this gift giving is to bless, okay? It isn't to feed the hunger of, to empty the stocks of corporate, supplies. The point of this celebration was to genuine gives from the heart, to celebrate, to rejoice. Food, big part of celebrating, is to eat and to drink, to have this feasting. Mordecai, verse 20, recorded these events and sent letters to the Jews near and far throughout all the provinces of King Xerxes, calling on them to celebrate an annual festival on these 2 days. He told them to celebrate these days. The word celebrate in the Hebrew, I'm not so good at Hebrew as I am with the Greek, okay? You know that, guys. But I was looking at these words. And what they basically mean is these are good days. To celebrate these days, they recognize these as good days. I think a lot of times when we want to celebrate, we have a lot of people who are wet blankets that want to tell us that these days that we celebrate are not good days. They're bad days. You shouldn't celebrate Christmas. You shouldn't celebrate Easter and these things. Bad, shame on you, Thanksgiving. But you know what? When I see the Bible, I see that there's a promoting of celebrating. These are good. And I go to the Hebrews. It's almost like to declare these are good days is to say, I'm not going to let anyone bring me down. I'm not going to let anyone rip me off. And celebration is a godly discipline. It's something that we ought to do. It gets our hearts right. If we're doom and gloom and woe is me and dead practical all day long, all week long, all year long, then we're going to have shallow souls. But we need to celebrate. We need to stretch ourselves and think about how much God's blessed us and how we want to just enjoy that and revel in it and be able to be there for others so they can revel in their celebration and their joy. It is a give and take situation celebration. They'll celebrate these days with feasting and gladness. And by giving gifts of food to each other and presents to the poor. And again, the point of this isn't to take from the rich and give to the poor. It's to share. And if people didn't have the ability to celebrate by giving gifts and rejoicing in that way, then we had a responsibility to make sure that they could do it. Isn't that awesome? So it's not just giving gifts to each other, but giving presents to the poor so they can do the same thing. So the whole point is everyone needs to celebrate. Okay? Make it economically such that, or so that we all can celebrate. So that the rich aren't celebrating in their little kingdoms, little castles, or little strongholds, while the poor are sitting there banging at the doors, begging to fall in. No. It's everyone needs to take part. Everyone needs to take part in celebration. And I think genuine, true celebration is something that should be shared by all people and should be available to all people. This would commemorate a time when the Jews gained relief from enemies. What's the point? Like, for instance, Christmas. The point of celebrating Christmas is to remember Jesus Christ came. The Son of God came to the earth to live an actual real life and minister on this planet so that he can die on the cross so we can have a right place with God, a right relationship with God. That's what we're celebrating with Christmas. And again, some people say, nah, you can't do that because celebrating's... So what they say is, you know what? I'm going to sacrifice Christmas. I'm going to sacrifice because my sacrifice is better than obedience. Well, wait a second. We just learned that's opposite. Obedience is better than sacrifice. And the irony is a lot of people who don't celebrate Christmas, they actually do celebrate Christmas and just in a different way. You know? Sorrow turned into gladness and the mourning into joy. So it wasn't a time for mourning. It wasn't a time for fasting. It was a time for gladness, celebration, feasting, gift giving. And by the way, guys, you can't just pick and choose your disciplines. I think a healthy Christian has a full understanding of all the Christian disciplines. If you're like that person who's just a bit mournful, I do the fasting, I do the mourning, I don't do the celebrating, then you're wonky, okay? Get it both. Work on the other one. It's like a musician. When you know you're good at certain techniques but not good at other techniques, you work on those other techniques to get better at it. So you can be a whole musician. Same thing with a Christian. Celebrate. Try celebrating. Work on that. Practice celebration. And if you're weak at prayer, work on that. If you're weak at worshiping, if you're weak at fasting, if you're weak at studying the Bible, devotions, work on where you're weak at. Don't just say, well, it's not my thing. No, work on it. Get strong at it. So they said, at this time, you put away the mourning, you put away the sackcloth, you put away the fasting, and you eat, and you celebrate, and you drink, and you think about how God has saved us from total annihilation. Now we're here celebrating. We have life. So the Jews accepted Mordecai's proposal and adopted this annual custom. Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews, had plotted to crush and destroy them on the date determined by casting lots, throwing of dice. The lots were called Purim. But when Esther came before the king, he issued a decree causing Haman's evil plot to backfire. And Haman and his sons were impaled on a sharpened pole. That is why this celebration is called Purim, because of the ancient word for casting lots. Next slide, please. Abundant joy. John 16, abundant joy. It comes from praying in the name of Jesus. I tell you the truth. John 16:20. You will weep and mourn over what is going to happen to me, but the world will rejoice. You will grieve, but your grief will be suddenly turned into wonderful joy. It will be like a woman suffering the pains of labors. When her child is born, her anguish gives way to joy because she has brought a new baby into the world. So you have sorrow now, but I will see you again, and you will rejoice, and no one can rob you of that joy. So again, the way of Christianity isn't just the mourning. There are times, like Ecclesiastes, there's time for fight, there's time for mourning, there's time for that stuff. But with Jesus Christ, when we acknowledge what Jesus has done for us, and when we see how we can actually pray to God and asking things in the name of Jesus, it doesn't just give us joy. So knowing Jesus gives us joy. It says, you have sorrow now, but I will see you again. So seeing Jesus, knowing Jesus will give us joy. You will rejoice. And no one can rob you of that joy. But listen to this, guys. This is an important thing. This is why I think prayer is very important. And at that time, you won't need to ask for anything. I tell you the truth that you will ask the Father directly. This is the time. He will grant you requests because you use my name. That's what we pray. We say in Jesus' name and stuff like that. Because we're praying to God through Jesus in His name, His will, His way, His purpose. Not ours, His. You haven't done this before. Asking using my name and you will receive. And you'll have abundant joy. So I'm not going to talk about the praying and the receiving bit. But what I want to look at is in prayer, and praying right prayers gives us abundant joy. Next slide. So let's finish this up. Esther 9, still in verse 26. So because of Mordecai's letter and because of what they had experienced, the Jews throughout the realm agreed to inaugurate this tradition and to pass it on to their descendants and to all who became Jews. They declared they would never fail to celebrate these two prescribed days at the point in time each year. These days would be remembered and kept from generation to generation and celebrated by every family throughout the provinces and cities in the empire. The festival of Purim would never cease to be celebrated among the Jews, nor would the memory of what had happened ever die out among the descendants. Now, just to make a note on that paragraph, there's two things. Notice what I've highlighted over and over and over again. Celebrate, 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 cerebral, celebrate, thinking, what is going on, memories. And I highlight that as well, memory, to remember, to never forget what has happened. The memories won't die. That's why we celebrate. We celebrate communion. So the memories of that won't die. Like Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, along with Mordecai, the Jew, wrote another letter, putting the queen's full authority behind Mordecai's letter to establish the festival of Purim. Letters wishing peace and security were sent to the Jews throughout the 127 provinces of the empire of Xerxes. These letters established the festival of Purim, an annual celebration of these days, the point in time, decreed by both Mordecai and the Jews and Queen Esther. The people decided to observe this festival just as they had decided for themselves, and their descendants to establish a time of fasting and mourning. Again, the reason why that parenthesis is put in is because there could be potential conflicts at the time with other ceremonial things going on, like fasting. And obviously fasting and feasting are two different things. Just like mourning and rejoicing are two different things. So they had to organize. When is the time to fast and when's the time to feast? When's the time to mourn? When's the time to rejoice? There's going to be, these ceremonial conflicts. And so they had to organize it for themselves, how they're going to do it. But they got to do it. You got to take time to celebrate. So the command of Esther confirmed the practice of Purim, and it was written down in the records. So in conclusion, we're finishing Esther's. In conclusion, just a couple verses in Esther's 10. The king Xerxes imposed a tribute throughout his empire, even to the distant coastlands. His great achievements and the full account of the greatness of Mordecai, whom the king had promoted, are recorded in the book of the kings of Media and Persia. Mordecai the Jew became the prime minister. And this actually kind of reminds me a lot of Joseph. And how with Joseph, his story is about how God led him and provided him and his providence all through Joseph's life as a slave and servant and all, even as a prisoner. And he also became the prime minister. How God had that plan for him, and nothing was going to thwart that plan. Same thing with Mordecai. Mordecai was forgotten for a while, but God remembered him. So he's a type of Joseph. So that Mordecai, the Jew, became the prime minister with authority next to that of the king Xerxes himself. He was very great among the Jews, who held him in high esteem, because he continued to work for the good of his people and to speak up for the welfare of all their descendants. We're done, guys. We went a little bit over. I apologize, but we're done. There's a time for fasting and mourning. And there's a time for feasting and rejoicing. So, celebrate, suckers. What are you waiting for? God has saved you.